Hello, it's Ruby, and today I'm going to be sharing every single book that I read in 2024. I always love filming this video. I'm always exhausted by the end of it though, because I know that I get distracted talking about them. You will also probably see a split because there are a lot of academic books that I read in the first half of this year when I was doing my masters. My masters was in early modern literature, so there is quite a lot of early modern writing on here, all of which is not all of which. Some of which is excellent, so I would, recommend it. But anyway, without further ado, let's just jump into it. So I use Storygraph to track all of my reading. I think you can follow me on there if you would like to. I will leave it linked down below if you would like to. I don't write reviews, I just share which book I'm reading at the moment. But if you did want to follow me, then you're very welcome. So the first book I read was Endymion by John Lyell. This is an early modern play, and it is excellent. It's fantastic. It was actually originally performed by a company of boy actors, so the entire thing was performed by children, but it is a commercial play, and it's basically about this shepherd who falls in love with a moon goddess, and it's his search for this unrequited love, and he meets all of these mythical beings in his quest to be with this moon goddess. And I really did enjoy it. The language in this is just beautiful. I took loads of quotes of it from my commonplace book. Then I read The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams, and this was fantastic, set in Oxford, and at the time the Oxford English Dictionary was being put together, and it's about the daughter of somebody who's working on the Oxford English Dictionary, and the whole of her childhood he's been working on it, and because he's a single father, she's often taken into the shed where they compile all of the words. And I love how it gives an insight into the process of making this dictionary. I did learn a lot through it, and off the back of reading this book I decided to do a lot more research into the Oxford English Dictionary. If you're not familiar with the Oxford English Dictionary, when you use it, you basically see how the word has been used in lots of different scenarios. So in the Oxford English Dictionary online, for example, you will see the word magic, and then it will give you examples and dates and case studies of where this word has been used, and then that can help you understand how the word used to be used, how it's used now, that kind of the subtleties of the language, which maybe the definition won't capture. And when they were originally putting together the dictionary, people would send in examples of certain words, and then they'd all be kept together in boxes. And so it was this big group effort, and they'd all be kept together in boxes, and you'd use them to form the definition when you got to that word. Such a cool process, and if you're interested in language, then definitely this is one worth reading. But the distinctive thing about this book is, with that as the backdrop, the daughter decides to start writing her own dictionary of words which aren't included in the dictionary, and specifically this is slang and kind of swear words, things that are used by normal people, and which kind of she thinks need a place in the dictionary, and so she makes her own, and she speaks with specifically this one woman at the Oxford Covered Market to learn these new words. It's really, really excellent, and a very moving story, and fantastic if you like language. Next I read Literary Cultures and Medieval and Early Modern Childhoods by Naomi Miller and Diane Purkis, edited by. It's a collection of essays about medieval and early modern childhood, and if you're interested in conceptions of childhood at this time, then this is definitely the book to read. It was written in 2019 and is the most recent book on criticism around childhood in this period. My research is on early modern childhood, and so this was a very important book to read. Then I read The Body Keeps Score, which I'm sure you've heard about. I had so many people recommending this to me. So the book is all about trauma and the relationship between trauma and the body, and how trauma is stored in the body and how that can then manifest. And it's a really accessible introduction to this. The author is one of the leading experts on trauma, and he does an excellent job of making it digestible for an ordinary reader. I love how it's not dumbed down, but it's also not difficult to understand, and I think that's really hard to do with a piece like this. So it was excellent, and if you're looking for a book on psychology, this is the one to go for. Then I read Elizabeth Tyrrett's Morning and Evening Prayers by Susan Felch. This was so good. Okay, this is one of those random things which I don't necessarily know how many people will like this, but I think it's so cool. So Susan Felch was, I think she was the lady's maid to Queen Elizabeth I, or Princess Elizabeth, and she wrote up these prayers which could then be said at morning and night, which was very traditional in upper class households, kind of mimicking the setup of a monastery or a nunnery where prayers would be said at specific points in the day. So she kind of wrote her own prayers which could be said, and they're just beautifully written, and they give a fantastic insight into kind of the religious domestic culture at the time. The coolest thing though is the structure of the books. Originally it was about this big, it was absolutely tiny, and it has little loops so that it could be connected to a dress or a belt, and it could be worn. So you've kind of got this beautiful interplay between the book and kind of like textiles and clothing, and kind of like how beautiful is it to have the book like physically close to your heart like that, and easily accessible all of the time. And if you want to learn more about Elizabeth Tyrwhitt, then Susan Felch, who was the editor of this collection, is the best person to go for. There isn't that much criticism on Elizabeth Tyrwhitt, but Susan Felch's work is brilliant. Then I read Candide by Voltaire. I've got this listed as January, but I have a feeling that I read that in December, so I'm really sorry if I mistaken, but I did not like Candide by Voltaire at all. I read it because I'd read, what did I read by him? I read something else by Voltaire last year and I didn't like it, and so I thought that I would read Candide to like have a fair assessment of Voltaire and whether I liked him, and I didn't like this either. It's highly satirical. Usually I do like satire, but this was just a little bit too weird for me, and weird in a way that I don't particularly enjoy. I know that Voltaire is one of those like love him or hate him. I love that he uses fiction to explore his philosophy and explain his philosophy, but I definitely didn't resonate with this as much as like Sartre or Camus' philosophy through fiction. I wouldn't recommend this, but give Voltaire a try because maybe you will really like him, but I just do not enjoy reading him. So next I read The Tragedy of Cleopatra by Samuel Daniel. So Samuel Daniel was one of the most eminent early modern playwrights. Some people say that this is a closet drama, but then there are other scholars like Dorothy Bowles who say that it's not, and that it's like meant for a wider audience than the closet drama. I looked at this play while doing a week on translation for one of my modules, and we compared it with other versions of the Antony and Cleopatra story. I've got to say that this was the least remarkable of the ones that we looked at, and this one really didn't stand out to me. I much preferred the Thomas Kyd, and specifically who was it by? Mary Sidney Herbert's Antonius, I loved. Then I read The French History by Anne Dowrich. This is an epic poem and it chronicles the French War on religion. It's a play all about religious polemic. Anne Dowrich is essentially exploring religious polemic in England through displacing it onto France and this French history. It's not an accurate history, and through rewriting it she is kind of like pointing to this political commentary, which is actually quite scandalous. Maureen Bell talks about how the beginning scene really points to this because it's set in France and it's set in this like kind of shrouded forest, and this Frenchman comes up and starts praising England, like he's walking along and he's going, oh, England is fantastic, England is wonderful, and of course especially at the time you would not get that, that's very unrealistic. So Maureen Bell says that it starts with this like veneer and the secrecy because the English reader does not believe him when he says that. It is quite amusing as well, and if you're interested in the kind of Protestant Catholic religious polemic, then you might enjoy this. I then read The Blazing World and Other Writings by Margaret Cavendish, which was fabulous. I need to check because I'm pretty sure I read that in December. I'm just jumping in because I did read this in January, but it just feels like such a long time ago that as I was filming I was really second guessing myself on all of these books from last January. Like, it just feels like a really long time since I've read them. So I didn't say anything about The Blazing World because I was like, oh, I don't think that was a book that I read this year, but I did read it at the beginning of January. So The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish, again, an early modern piece, and some people say that it's the first piece of science fiction, like the first sci-fi novel. It's very similar to Gulliver's Travels, like it's got a very similar atmosphere to it, and the storyline is quite similar. Basically, this lady travels to this imaginary world and she becomes the ruler of it, she becomes an empress, and everything is very topsy-turvy, everything's quite absurdist, it doesn't really make sense, and through this imaginary world she's able to explore some very key philosophical questions about what it means for something to be real and true, and the idea of kind of the imaginary is also very interesting in this because you're constantly grappling with like the question of whether this is real, and if she's imagining it, whether that can still make it real, and it's just deeply philosophical, and yeah, very cool to see a piece of philosophy like this kind of published in the mainstream by a woman at this time. So would highly recommend it. It's very, very good. Okay, so then I read Sweetman's The Arrangement of Lewd, Idle, Forward and Unconstant Woman. This is basically a very, very misogynistic narrative about how women do not... Also, do excuse the fact that I have not read these books for basically a year, and so I'm grappling to try and remember what they're about. This is a very highly misogynistic piece about how women's only role is childbirth and how they're not good for anything else, and it's vile, like it's absolutely horrible. It's so rude and disrespectful towards women, but because it is so awful, it's actually kind of amusing to read because you just can't believe it. And it must be remembered that, like, it's funny because I think when, especially kind of like at GCSE and A-level, when you're thinking about context around the early modern period, people will say, oh, you know, like all men hated women, and there was kind of, you know, like misogyny was very much ingrained, and yes, it was, and there is a lot, especially in like the legal system, which is highly misogynistic at this time. But then a book like this comes out, and he did get a lot of backlash. It's not like every man in England was agreeing with him. This was definitely kind of a one-off piece, and it got a load of responses, like publications done in response to this saying, okay, this is ridiculous, and satirizing this. So it's an interesting piece in terms of like pamphlet culture. I read Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. It's about a poor farmer who lives in rural Oxfordshire, and he dreams of going to the City of Dreaming Spies, going to the University of Oxford, but he's dreadfully poor and he doesn't know Latin and he doesn't know Greek, and of course you need to know Latin and Greek if you want to even apply for Oxford. And so slowly but surely he teaches himself Latin and Greek, and more than anything he wants to be a scholar and he wants to go to the university. But tragically, I mean, it's a tragic story, but kind of circumstances with two lovers, Sue and Arabella, kind of keep on getting in the way, and it's, oh my gosh, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, and it's so sad, but it's beautiful, and there are so many kind of striking moments in this book that I think about often. Like, there are some really memorable scenes, but I won't say them because I will spoil it if I do. Just read this book. If you're going to read a Hardy, this is the one to read. So then I was doing an essay on catechism, so I ended up reading quite a lot around catechisms, but I read Catechisms Written for Mothers, Schoolmistresses and Children, edited by Paula McQuaid, and it's basically facsimiles of catechisms. A catechism is like kind of Socratic, so it uses a question and answer format to teach a child about religion. So it will say, oh, what is the Holy Trinity? And then the answer will be, oh, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and you kind of go through this question and answer format, and through doing so you teach the child about religion. And it was a really key part of early modern kind of childhood routine. So in the morning or evening they would practice their catechism with a parent. I also read Catechisms and Women's Writing in 17th Century England by Paula McQuaid, which is a book about catechisms, and this was brilliant, the best kind of thing on catechisms that I read. Then I went into reading some fiction, finally. I read My Brother's Ghost by Alan Ahlberg, which was so dreadfully sad. Oh my gosh, I haven't actually thought about that book for a while, but that was sad. It's really short. I think it's about 40 pages and it's all illustrated, and it's about a boy whose brother dies, and then his ghost comes back and he's haunted by the ghost, and it's so tragic. I want to reread that now. I read Time as a Mother by Ocean Vuong, which is a collection of poetry. Of course, Ocean Vuong also wrote Ocean's... what's it called? Oh no, what's it called? On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, and Time as a Mother was brilliant. Okay, I'm not even at the end of January yet, and I do actually need to go because I'm getting a train soon. So I'm just going to do one more, which is Hansel and Gretel by Neil Gaiman. It's a rewriting of the Hansel and Gretel story, but it's much darker. Well, actually, I say much darker. The Grimm's fairy tale is not particularly light, but it's got that like Coraline air to it, and the atmosphere, and that creepiness, that eeriness, that uncanniness, which is signature to Neil Gaiman's books. And I also love the illustrations, which totally add to it. They're very much like Tinder by Sally Gardner. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for now, and I will pick this back up probably day after tomorrow, and then I can share this video with you eventually. But thank you so much for watching so far. Happy 2025. It's actually 2025 now. I celebrated New Year with Blakeney. She came down and we spent 3 nights here and had a party with some friends of my parents and some family, and it was really, really fun. And I'm now actually going to finish telling you the books that I read last year. Not this year anymore, it's last year, which is so strange. One thing I didn't say before actually is last year, for the first time in maybe a decade, I didn't set myself a reading challenge. So usually I will set a set number of books that I want to read, and I will keep track of them as I'm going through the year. Like, I will always know how many books I've read so far that year, but last year for the first time I didn't. And I was planning on filming a video kind of reflecting on that and what I learned through not having a reading challenge, but I will reflect on that another time. So then next I read 2 plays. They were in the same edition though, so I've counted them as one book, but that's Mary Sidney Herbert's Antonius and Thomas Kyd's Cornelia. Antonius and Cornelia are both again stories of Antony and Cleopatra. This again predates Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and some scholars say that Antonius was like the inspiration for Shakespeare's play. And even though Antonius is a translation of a French play by Garnier, she takes a lot of creative license with translation, even if it's in very granular changes of the language. So for example, there is one part which translates directly as half dead, like talking about Antony as half dead. However, Mary Sidney Herbert calls it life dead, says that he's life dead. And there are lots of kind of instances of that where if you look at the language in a very granular way, you can kind of see how much care she was taking in the translation, and also how she's able to creatively express herself and kind of tell the story of Cleopatra creatively, even though it's a translation. And it's just a really good case of thinking about alternate forms of female writing at a time where translation was a respectable form of writing for women, but kind of how this became a creative form of writing and wasn't just rote. And it's really wonderful, it's excellent, and if you do read it, you should read the Bell and Cottagines. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the surname, but you should read that edition, which has the most excellent footnotes and really helps you to kind of understand the differences in translation. So would recommend this. And then yeah, like Thomas Kyd's Cornelia is again story of Antony and Cleopatra, though again not like super stand out in my mind. And then next I read The Cry of the Stone, which is kind of by Anna Chapnell but also by a relator, and so it's not like written by her, but it's instead a transcription of this kind of performance sort of thing, this prophecy that she delivered at Whitehall in 1654. And she basically allegedly stood in the middle of Whitehall and spoke for 11 days straight. She didn't sleep, she didn't eat, and she kind of delivered as a vessel this prophecy from God, and it was then transcribed and then it was published, and shortly afterwards a second text, which is Legacy for Saints, was also published, and there were 2 or 3 others published in that same year. And I did read all of these this year. I actually wrote an essay on Anna Chapnell, and she's fascinating. Like, the writing is not like, it's not really easy to read, I would say, and it's very odd. It doesn't really follow cohesively, it doesn't really make sense, but it's very nice to kind of read aloud. So I practice like reading it aloud a lot, and I memorize part of it to really get a sense of like how it sounds. And I think when you think of it like a performance, it really changes the way that you read it. So it's cool, and if you're looking for a very like different sort of literature, then you might want to give that a go, though she is kind of like known for being hard to read because it's just so weird. Oh, and I also read the translation of A Discourse of Life or Death by Monet. This is kind of like an early modern essay on life and death. Yeah, I read it because when Antonius was published, it was published alongside this essay. Next I read Imagining Cleopatra, Performing Gender and Power in Early Modern England by Yasmin Arshad, and this is the one that I was thinking about earlier. It's the collection of essays all about Cleopatra in early modern England and kind of depictions of Cleopatra, and this was so fantastic, like one of the best pieces of criticism I read. If you like Antony and Cleopatra by Shakespeare, then you should definitely read this because it's very enlightening and slightly speculative research, but I do like speculative research. Next, okay, one of the top books that I read this year, I adored this. I read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, and I'm still thinking about this book. Like, I would highly recommend this to anyone who hasn't already read it. It's so funny because when I was like, when I put it on my list to read, part of me was expecting it to be a little bit stuffy, which is bizarre too because I read The Brothers Karamazov, and that is like as far from stuffy as you can possibly get, but there's weirdly this like cultural thing of like Dostoevsky being very, very difficult and very heavy, and yes, it's heavy, but it being like a little bit stuffy, and we have that misconception about the classics so much. Like when we think about Dickens and it's like, oh, old and dusty Dickens, when really he's definitely not that. He's very, very far from that. And Crime and Punishment just completely resists that kind of cultural expectation around the classics, because it's like so unhinged. Like it's so unhinged as a book. It's about a man's descent into madness after a murder. So he murders somebody, and it's the mental anguish that he then feels afterwards, and it's so much of it is internal. Like so much of it is him kind of like mulling over his own guilt and driving himself slowly insane, and it's just so wonderfully written, like as a kind of descent into madness. I think about this book so often, and I know I will reread it at some point, and I'm already looking forward to rereading it, and I want to read much more Dostoevsky off the back of this. Then I read The Tragedy of Miriam by Elizabeth Carey, and I did read 2 different editions of this actually. This is a closet drama, meaning it was a play that was performed in the home in early modern England. Elizabeth Carey was from an upper class household, and she wrote this when she was really quite young, and then some scholars say that it wasn't performed, but there is very convincing scholarship which kind of argues that it was performed, and that she was kind of known within her own circles as a dramatist. It's basically about the biblical story of Herod and Salome and Miriam, and kind of a take on that. Next, Lyra's Oxford by Philip Pullman. I have already read this, but because I wasn't Oxford and because this is very short, I did decide to reread this. It's like an offshoot of his Dark Materials. It's about this witch who is unwell, and her familiar travels to Oxford looking for help for its witch, and Lyra agrees to help, and it's everything that happens. And it's also got woodcuts by Philip Pullman, which are brilliant. Next, I read The Island of Whispers by Frances Hardinge. I love Frances Hardinge. She just has this very haunting writing style. Like her work is very haunting. It's a little bit like Neil Gaiman. It's also beautifully illustrated, and it's very like eerie. I don't know when it's set. I want to say like it's very undistinctive. Like it almost feels medieval, but then it also doesn't. Like it feels later than medieval, but it's kind of got a medieval air to it because it's set in a small village. But it's about this family, and the father will take the dead bodies of those who die to this island, and that's kind of where they're like deposited. And so when they die, they travel across the ocean in this boat with this man, like Charon in the Greek myths, but this man takes the bodies, and then they're free, and their souls are free to kind of move on. And it's about a princess, I think she's a princess, who falls very ill, and her body has to be taken to the island, but the king is in disbelief and doesn't want to accept it, and it's kind of everything that happens as a result of that. It's very sad and very beautiful. Then I read the poems of Amelia Lanier again, an early modern poet. Her work is brilliant. I especially love her Apology of Eve, which is all about how Eve should not be blamed for the fall, and it's really cool to see that narrative emerging so early. Her poetry was also only discovered fairly recently, I think about 20 years ago, and since then a wonderful online edition has been set up. So if you want to read it, then I would recommend like looking at that online edition, which I will link down below. Then I read Milk and Honey by Ruby Carr, which I know was very, very popular a long time ago, and I never read it. I wanted to read some modern poetry, and I had like found that quote. I've actually got it on the back of my laptop because I really like it. We are all born beautiful, the greatest tragedy is being convinced we are not. And so it was that quote that got me to read the poetry. It's very heavy, and I would give a trigger warning for sexual abuse because it's very heavy and graphic and deeply, deeply sad, but also beautiful. Then I read some more Mary Sidney Herbert. I really did love Mary Sidney Herbert. She was one of the standout authors of this year. The Sidney Psalter, which is the Psalms that Mary and her brother Philip translated together, and her brother actually died halfway through the translation, so they translated the first few, and then she continued the translation and wrote the rest of them. And these are just so beautiful. I think they are my favourite translations of the Psalms, and I've dipped into these quite a few times. I will leave my favourite one linked down below as well. I won't read it for you, but it's fantastic and you should go and read it. And then I read some war poetry by Siegfried Sassoon. I found this edition in a charity shop, and it was just a small pamphlet, and I studied the war poets at A-level. I kind of took a trip down memory lane in rereading this, and it's so funny because at the time I wasn't the biggest fan of Sassoon, and I much preferred Rosenberg. Like, Isaac Rosenberg is my favourite of the war poets from the First World War, but I found that these were very powerful, and I found them much more moving this time around. I would recommend Sassoon. I do prefer Sassoon over Owen as well. Next, I read Reading Children in Early Modern Culture by Ida Lamb. Fantastic book on how children read and the cultures of reading with early modern children. I read this a couple of times actually. Another book of criticism, there is quite a lot of criticism. I read Documents of Performance in Early Modern England by Tiffany Stern. Tiffany Stern is incredible if you want to read about early modern performance culture and like how plays were actually performed at the Globe and Blackfriars and the Rose. So if you're interested in performance, or if you're studying anything to do with Shakespeare, then you should read this book. Tiffany Stern is great, and she's also a very engaging writer. Like, she's very fun to read. Then I read The Wits on Weddings by Philip Larkin. This was like a Faber edition of poetry. It's one of his first poetry collections from 1964. Next, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, which is the story of Oedipus, which of course you all know because of Freud. Like, the Oedipus complex was adapted from this, about a man who accidentally marries his mother and kills his father. Basically, there's a prophecy which says that he's going to marry his mother and kill his father, and he's so terrified by the prospect of this that he runs away, like hoping that it won't happen, and then kind of it does end up happening. This is one of the best books I read this year as well. I read Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, which somehow I had never read. One of my friends at Exeter, Sasha, loved Dr. Faustus, like it was her favourite book, and I kept on meaning to read it. It's wonderful. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it took me so long, and I read it twice. I read it twice last year because I loved it so much. Oh no, is it okay? Oh my gosh, how is that okay? I can't believe that survived. Dr. Faustus is about a scholar who is very, very arrogant and not very nice a person at all, and he basically really wants to be the best scholar in the whole of the world, and he wants to know everything there is to know. And so what better way to do that than making a pact with the devil, which he does, and he sells his soul, and he becomes brilliant, and he learns all of these things, and he's very respected, and he just keeps on putting off the time when the devil will kind of like take his soul. Basically, Dr. Faustus has exhausted all knowledge like that can be learnt a posteriori, like from books and the natural world, and so he starts turning to like dark magic, and that's where the devil comes in, and he ends up becoming like a magician, and he accesses all of this power. He is able to harness it. It's brilliant writing, and again, fantastic around like ideas of madness and guilt and magic. Then I also read Oedipus at Colonus, which is another of the plays by Oedipus by Sophocles. It was in the same collection. So then next I read Order and Disorder by Lucy Hutchinson. Again, this is an early modern female poet, and it is an early modern female writer, and this is a rewriting of the story of Genesis. If you want to read some early modern female writers, who you definitely should, this has got like a big list of books that you should read. Like, I read a lot of early modern female writers, kind of trying to resist that male canon, because it's funny, when we think back to the early modern period, we think like, oh, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Milton, these big, huge names. But more recently, like increasingly in the last 20 years, there's been such exciting scholarship kind of delving into these female writers who were so influential and had such an impact, yet haven't been studied quite so much. And their writing is wonderful, so if you are wanting to read more 17th century and 16th century work, then you should definitely try these female writers. Next I read Reading It Wrong, an alternative history of early 18th century literature by Abigail Williams. This is basically challenging the idea of like a good way to read and the right way to read. So thinking about instances where a book was read like incorrectly, and how that's really interesting, and how it helps us understand readers, and how that's actually really interesting, and that's still a very valid form of reading, and how we overlook so many types of reading and like instances of reading just because it's not read like the right way. And so she unpicks what it means to read correctly. There is so much like interesting stuff in here, and I would highly recommend you try this. It's very recent, I think, don't know what year, but like the last 5 years. Maybe the best way to demonstrate what she's doing is, you know, when you read like an Austen book or something from the 18th century, and they'll say like, they'll put like a little gap, like a dash, and and then it will say Shire, so it'll be like, oh, in the county of Shire, and they'll leave a gap. In some books you will see that readers have added in the name of the shire, and sometimes these are incorrect, quote unquote, to maybe what was like intended or expected or makes sense. And so she's kind of like thinking about those instances where the reader does not behave in the way that maybe the reader is expected to behave, or we think about the reader behaving, and what it tells us about how we think about like the reader as a universal thing. It's really, really good. I really enjoyed this work. I also read Book Parts by Dennis Duncan and Adam Smythe. It basically goes through the book and it chooses different elements of the book. So things like the cover, the dedication letter, like of patronage, and it like teaches you about the different elements of books in the 17th century. And it's also really well written, like it's very engaging, it's very fun to read. Then I read On the Shortness of Life, Life is Long If You Know How to Use It by Seneca, and this was brilliant again. And this is an essay about what it means to live and how life will always be too short. Like, we live so much without thinking about the fact that we are living, and it's only in our final few moments, or it's only when we realise that we're coming to an end, that life suddenly feels really short. And so Seneca's kind of trying to get us to think about how we can make life long, and how by being present and being kind of like intentional throughout our lives, we're able to make life longer, and we can maybe not have that moment of like, oh wow, life was too short, I didn't do what I wanted to do. Then I read Gallant by V.E. Schwab. Love V.E. Schwab's writing. It's the second thing I've read by her. She also wrote The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which was my best book of 2023. And Gallant is about an orphan who is sent to this house. She receives a letter from a distant relative summoning her to this house, Gallant, and so she goes, and when she arrives it turns out that nobody actually sent for her, and her uncle, who had apparently sent the letter, has been dead for many years, and so it's all the confusion that then arises, and she's trying to understand her parents and her story and why this house is just slightly off, like there is an eeriness to it, and life and death kind of collide within. It's really clever and a great piece of fantasy writing. I then read Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre, which kind of explores his existential philosophy but through fiction, and I love when books do this, like kind of along the same grain as The Fall by Albert Camus. So the protagonist basically feels alienated from the things around him. It's all written like a diary as well. In Descartes' philosophy, he talks about looking out a window and thinking, how do I not know that everyone around me is just an automaton? It's kind of got that air of isolation, alienation, like feeling very separate from everything around you. Like, he talks about the there-ness of objects and his separation from it. He gets this feeling of nausea where the book gets its name, thinking about how meaningless all of life is, and it's a great way to think about existentialism. I really did enjoy this book. My camera ran out, so I've changed to a different one and also taken this opportunity to get some tea. This is the mint choc chip rooibos tea, and it's from Bird and Blend. And it's so good. I love chocolate tea and I love peppermint tea. If you love chocolate tea and you love peppermint tea, this is the perfect tea. And it's still rather hot, but it's very, very tasty. So let's get back to books. So we got up to Nausea. Nausea. Next I read Good Bones by Margaret Atwood, and it's a collection of short stories. I'd never read Margaret Atwood's short stories before, bar one. I'd read this one on, I'm so bad at titles, but it was something to do with like my mother, my evil mother or something. These are kind of feminist stories and explore what it means to be a woman, kind of exploring like pressures which are put on women, especially aesthetic pressures. Then I read The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, and I read this while I was in Paris because I do like to do location-based reading. I think it's very fun to do, and I love thinking about how space inspires a work, but also how the experience of reading is then enhanced by kind of having access to the space. And so I read part of this book actually looking at the Notre Dame in the Shakespeare & Co bookshop in Paris. This is one of Blakeney's favourite books and also one of my friend Lucy's favourite books, and so I was really excited to read it. I've got to say, maybe it's because it was hyped up to me so much, but it wasn't as good as I was expecting it to be. Maybe it was the translation I read too. I feel like this book, it's kind of got like the feel of a Dickens novel, but it doesn't kind of have like the additive and like kind of slight absurdity, slight like opulence of Dickens's writing, There were passages that I loved, like the really tender people-focused passages I thought were wonderful, and I did love like the vast cast of characters and seeing how all of these people like interact and how their stories overlap, and I did really enjoy, contrary to what I think a lot of people say, I really loved the descriptions of Notre Dame, and Notre Dame is said to be like a character in this novel because it's so prevalent in like so many of the scenes, and there are these long descriptions of how wonderful the building is, and kind of the building itself will be expressing kind of like emotion, which I loved. I loved the way that kind of architecture operated in this book, but it's quite like adventure-ish. It's not an adventure book, but it's kind of got like the feel of an adventure book, and I don't really love adventure books, so I think that's why I didn't like it. So there were parts that I loved, and there are passages that I have photocopied and that I put in my commonplace book, but as a whole I wasn't the biggest fan of it. I am going to try and go a little bit faster as well, I'm sorry, because I always end up talking about books for much longer than I expect I will. So I then read Achilles by Elizabeth Cook, and it's a retelling of the story of Achilles, and very like water metaphor heavy. There are some lovely lines in it, but I wasn't the biggest fan of this book. It wasn't really for me. It was quite sensual, which I don't particularly enjoy in books. I did like that the writing was lyrical, but it wasn't, I don't know what it was, like I think objectively the writing is quite lyrical, but it also didn't feel particularly lyrical, if that makes sense. Like, I don't really know how to describe it. I read Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter, which before this I'd only dipped into, and as the name suggests, it's kind of the story of grief of a man losing his wife and the impact that this has on the everyday. It captures that absence of grief really beautifully. I've never lost anyone as close to me as the character in this does, but I can imagine this being a very helpful, kind of validating book if you have lost someone very close to you. I read With Faith and Physic, The Life of a Tudor Gentlewoman, which is the diaries of Lady Grace Mildmay from 1552 to 1620 by Linda Pollock, and this was one of the best books I read this year. I loved it. It's like, Lady Grace Mildmay was a Tudor gentlewoman, and she spent a lot of her life in her family home. She was also very religious. She was a herbalist, and she was also very religious, and these writings are very Christian, and kind of about like the importance of religious piety, etc. But it's also very astute, and I love the centrality of family and the centrality of the home in her writing, and I just really did enjoy it, and it's a book that I would like to own a copy of because I got that from the library. I read The Drama of Being a Child, The Search for the True Self, which is a book of psychology about like the impact of childhood on our future selves. It was very accessible, very interesting. I didn't like it as much as The Body Keeps Score, but I did like it. Then I read Three Tragedies by Renaissance Women. This was edited by Diane Purkis, and it has three Renaissance tragedies. One of them is Antonius, one of them is The Tragedy of Marion, and one of them is, what is the third one in this collection? Oh, The Tragedy of Iphigenia by Jane Lumley, and I really did love the Iphigenia by Jane Lumley. I also read that in manuscript, actually. I went to the British Library and I read that play by Jane Lumley, but like in the original manuscript, which was incredible, like an amazing experience. Next, I read The Child Reader by Granby. This is about 18th century children's reading habits, and I really loved this. It was excellent. Next, The Renaissance, Studies in Art and Poetry by Walter Pater. This is a selection of essays by Walter Pater on the importance of the Renaissance and why the Renaissance is so integral to like the formation of modern art, and Walter Pater, kind of typical of the fin de siècle essay culture. Essays in the 1890s, they read much more beautifully than like academic essays today. Like, they are poetic and they're lovely, they're beautifully written, and I love a good piece of 1890s art criticism, so I loved this. I read an extract from this in 2023 and was inspired to read the whole thing, so I did enjoy that. My favourite of this book is the conclusion and the chapter on, what is it? I need to get my copy. I'm sure I marked it. The Winkleman I liked, but my favourite was, oh yeah, The School of Giorgione. That was my favourite. But it basically goes through different Renaissance authors and kind of talks through their story and like what they were inspired by, and it helps you learn about the different artists. But he writes it just so beautifully, and so I would highly recommend this. Next, The Girl Who Couldn't Read by John Harding. It's set in a psychiatric hospital in, I don't know where. I want to say America, but I can't remember if it was America or like the coast in England. I can't remember, but It's this asylum, and there's this new doctor who arrives, but he's not actually the doctor he says he is, and he is like pretending to be a doctor, and he comes across this patient who cannot read but is obsessed with books, and she doesn't speak, and she spends all of her time just like looking at the pictures, and it's like him trying to understand where that fascination comes from and trying to like understand her. And if you're interested in early psychology and how mental health patients were treated, like how women would be treated in psychiatric hospitals, then you might find this interesting. I mean, I would say it's like slightly a bubblegum read, much more plot-based than language-based, I will say. I did like it, but it was quite predictable at the same time. It's good light reading. Also, this is when it's so funny actually looking at the dates on these books, because I had a massive reading slump around the time of my dissertation, and so I read so much in January and February, and then from March to May I barely read anything, and it's really funny looking at the dates to see kind of like how they line up. So then I read Autobiography in Early Modern England by Adam Smythe, which is thinking about and unpicking what autobiography actually is, and looks at, for example, like almanacs and how that's a form of autobiography, and just tries to unpick what it means for someone to write an autobiography. Oxford Botanic Garden and Arbitorium, A Brief History, which is just about how the Oxford Botanical Gardens came to be. It talks about like where the funding came from, and what the gardens were originally used for, and like displays and plants that have been there over the years, and I did find it very interesting because I liked visiting the botanical gardens last year. Then I read Jung on Alchemy, because I don't know much of Carl Jung, to be honest. I haven't read much about him, even though he's obviously a very famous psychoanalyst, and so I just wanted to kind of get a better sense and understand, and I'd heard about his ideas around alchemy, like a friend mentioned that it was interesting, and honestly a lot of the books that I read last year were around like ideas of the occult and magic, and so I guess this kind of fits into those wider reading preferences last year. I also read Micrographia by Robert Hooke, and again I read this in the original 1655 edition with all of these beautiful pictures. It's a wonderful piece of like it was very distinctive when it was written, because it has these like large print pictures, and it's all about kind of looking at the miniature. So the book takes the role of a microscope, and so instead of using a microscope you can just look in the book and then it shows you what you would see under a microscope. And so one of the things is like a full stop, and it's really giant, and you can see like the kind of ink blobs around the side, and it's very cool, and like the pictures are just as important as the language here, and it's really cool in relation to early modern science. I'm honestly losing my voice. I'm so tired. I don't know what it is about this video that always makes me really tired, because it's a lot of talking all at once, and also a lot of like remembering, because these are books that I read 6 months ago, and so it can be quite hard to like remember details. Then I read The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, which is by Mitch Albom, who also wrote Tuesdays with Morrie. I really love Mitch Albom's work, and I actually am reading another of his books. It's called One More Day at the moment. It's very like life affirming, his books, and in this one it's a man who works at a fairground. He's very old, and one of the fairground rides starts to collapse, and there is a child underneath, so he reaches forward to kind of like save them, and he dies in the process, and then he goes to heaven and goes through the different like stages of heaven, and each stage of heaven is introduced by somebody whose life kind of intersected with his own, and they might not be people that kind of he particularly remembers, but all of them are really significant in his journey and to kind of making sure that he did survive. And they're kind of, you hear these stories, or he hears these stories of people who had a massive impact on his life, but he didn't even know who they were, or he didn't realise, and it's kind of wonderful for thinking about how everybody is connected in the world, and it's very life-affirming, as I say. Then I read Bluets by Maggie Nelson, which is basically an academic, quasi-academic study of the colour blue, and thinks about like all of these. You learn so much about the colour blue, the history of the colour blue, why the colour blue is significant in poetry and art, even something like how blue plates won't traditionally be used in kind of fancy restaurants because blue looks like mould. But you learn so much about the colour blue. I love how it's like kind of academic, so you hear like different theories around the colour blue, but also it's very lyrical and it's written very beautifully. The reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson, much awaited new Holly Jackson book. I love Holly Jackson's work, and it's a mystery just as gripping, just as fast paced as all of her other books. It's about a girl whose mother went missing when she was very, very young, and nobody knows what happened to her and seemed to have come out of nowhere. And the story has always been incredibly fascinating, and so there's a documentary series. Sorry, the camera died again, so I'm back to the other one. So then her mother turns up, and it's kind of like discovering what happened to the mother during that period. I read Girl Interrupted, which had been highly recommended to me. It's about, again, about like, I was like, this is a memoir, and I didn't actually realise at the beginning. It's about a young woman with BPD who is sent to a psychiatric hospital, and it's her experiences there. And one thing I really love about it, I mean, it's really haunting. There are some really beautiful, tender moments. It is heavy, and just so interesting to get an insight into what a psychiatric hospital was like at that time. I also love how within the narrative there are kind of actual facsimiles of her documents, like kind of things that doctors had written about her, which was really interesting to see in a memoir like this. I read Practice by Rosalind Brown, which wasn't exactly what I was expecting it to be. It ended up being like a very graphic novel, which surprised me and I wasn't expecting, and I would say that as a disclaimer for this book if you read it. But it's about an undergraduate at Oxford, and she lives within like a very strict routine, and I really love the Oxford descriptions and the descriptions of her like daily routine, like kind of her study habits and all of this, but I didn't like all of it. But I would give a warning because I don't know if I would have read it. Next I read The Cousins, which is the same author as One of Us is Lying, that series. So basically this grandmother has disowned her children, and when her children had children, she never like went to meet them, so the grandmother has never met these 3 children. And then each of these cousins receives a letter inviting them to the grandmother's like private island for the summer, and so they end up going, and it's them kind of uncovering their messy family history. If you like a mystery, this is a really good one, and it's very fast paced. I also read Wilder Girls by Rory Power, which is about a pandemic. It's about this school, and it's located on an island, and all of the children and students are infected with this particular disease, and you don't really get details about what this disease is, but it's been catastrophic for the school population, and nobody's allowed to leave the island, and it's this group of students who are basically trying to figure out what's happened. It wasn't my favourite book. Like, from the blurb it sounds really, really good, and I thought I'd really enjoy it, but I didn't just personally get on with the writing so much. I read Ophelia Swam, an Oxford novel by Kelly Swain. Sorry, I said that weirdly. But this was so great. Again, one of the best books I read this year. This is in the top 5 too. This is again related to Lady Grace Mildmay, who I mentioned before, like her religion memoirs. So it's like a combination of Lady Grace Mildmay and Ophelia from Hamlet, and set in, it's a universe where Ophelia didn't die, but instead she was washed up on a riverbank, and she was found by this herbalist who then takes her in, and it's a very slow-paced novel. It's written by the seasons, and you go through these seasons of Ophelia is slowly starting to open up to the rest of the convent, find her voice and understand what happened between her and Hamlet, and she begins to connect to nature, and she learns about herbalism, and it's just a really beautiful novel, like very unlike anything I've read before, and I would highly recommend if you love introspective novels. Next is Devotion by Patti Smith. I've never read anything by Patti Smith, but I kind of read this to like get a sense of whether I like her writing, and because I did, I am planning on reading Just Kids, or like As Kids, whatever the book is that she's written, like the long like magnum opus of hers. It's basically an autobiographical like writing memoir, and talks about her creative inspirations for writing, where they come from, and it's all done through stories, and the stories are very, like, again, they're very introspective, they're very lyrical, they're very like emotion person led as opposed to circumstance led. And there's also a story within this which isn't her, and if it were her I'd be very, very like concerned, but there's a story in here about an ice skater, figure skater, and she just figure skates for the sake of figure skating, like she does it just for the love of doing it, and then her goals become like sidelined and become arbitrary, because she starts instead thinking about it, because instead she starts looking outwards at how figure skating can serve her like more capitalistically, and it's like a really sad take on growing up and like understanding the world. I've been filming for an hour and a half now, and slowly but surely The energy is lagging, so I'm going to go even faster. I keep on saying I'm going to go faster and then I don't. We've got this, and I've got my mint chocolate chip rooibos tea, which is still going strong. I hope you've got a cup of tea too. I feel like these videos work better when there's already been like a video with monthly reviews. Like, I was thinking about potentially bringing back the monthly reviews, but maybe doing them seasonally, so like every spring, summer, autumn, winter, doing a video roundup of the books I read then. So let me know if you'd like that and if you kind of like the reading roundups. Next, I read the love letters between Vita Sackville-West and Virginia Woolf, and I read these because my friend Lucy is a very big fan of Virginia Woolf and said that I just had to read these letters. It's kind of made up of not just letters but also journal fragments where each of them is writing about the other, and it's all done chronologically, and it's about, yeah, well, I mean, as the title says, love letters. It's them falling in love and kind of how their relationship progresses over, I think it's like a 10 or 15 year period. It's a lovely one to dip in and out of, but also so lovely to kind of read progressively and see what changes in their relationship, especially towards the end where they're both growing older and kind of start to see each other slightly differently. Then I reread Milton's Comus, which is one of my favourite books of all time, and I would put it in my top 5, but that would be unfair because it's in my top 10 favourite books. It's actually a masque, so a masque is a kind of play, it's a bit like a play, and it was first performed in 1634 by the Edgerton children at Ludlow Castle, but it was written by John Milton, and it's basically about the lady, this girl who goes into the forest and she comes across Comus, who is the son of Bacchus and Circe, I think. So it's a very like odd combination. It's a dangerous combination if you know your Greek myths, like Bacchus and Circe together. Not a good combination. It's Comus trying to seduce the lady and how she's able to overcome that through piety but also supernatural force, and it's very good. It's beautifully written. I think personally I think Milton's best lines are in this piece. I finally read Emma by Jane Austen. How many years has this been on my TBR? I think every single year, if I were like at the beginning of the year when I write down my list of like, these are the books I'm definitely going to read this year, Emma is always number one. It's been number one for the last 5 years, and yet I only just read it. And I actually really liked it. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of Jane Austen, and I think that's why I've been putting it off. But then I've always said, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of Jane Austen because I didn't like Persuasion and I didn't like Pride and Prejudice. But I've actually now read quite a few Jane Austens which I've really liked. Like, I loved Sense and Sensibility, and I really loved Emma, and what was the other one I read and liked? Mansfield Park I quite liked, and I also really enjoyed Jane Austen's Juvenilia, so maybe even I need to go back and reread Pride and Prejudice to see if I like it now.
I didn't say anything about the actual plot of Emma, but in a nutshell, Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, had lived nearly 21 years in this world with very little to distress or vex her, and she thinks of herself as being very good at matchmaking between people and like securing marriages between people. And then in the book she is trying to secure a marriage between her best friend Harriet and this man, and it's all of the drama that comes about as a result.
Of course, Emma is this really headstrong character. She's got a very strong will, really thinks that she's right. She's incredibly flawed as a character, and that's why she's so wonderful to read. Like, she is quite frustrating, really quite frustrating, but I love that complexity, and it's so wonderful to have such a complex character. And her friendship with Harriet I think is so beautiful, especially because she's so mean to Harriet. Like, she can be so awful to her, and it's horrible to read sometimes, and then you get this moment of tenderness and you see how much she loves her and how much she cares about her, and it just really complicates like what does love look like, and it's really good. You should read Emma. If it's on your TBR and you've been putting it off like I have, then you should read it. I then read Bacchae. Is it Bacchae? I think it's Bacchae by Euripides. And this one is very famous, and I've been meaning to read it for a long time, and it was also actually the first play by Euripides that I've read. Then I read Little House on the Prairie, and I did speak about this in a video, but I wasn't the biggest fan of this. Like, I was really expecting to love it, and I think it's because I went into this book with the expectation that it would be a lot like Anne of Green Gables, and it has got some of that, and I do like how it's provincial, and I love the importance of family and the home, but I just didn't really like it, and I think if I'd read it when I was younger I probably would have liked it. So I read Secrets of Mallory Towers as well, which is based on the Enid Blyton books, but this one's actually by Pamela Cox. It was only written in 2009. This is my favourite of the Mallory Towers books, which is very controversial considering it's not even by the original author. But it's about Susan's little sister Daffy and her beginning at the school, and she's just very mischievous, and it's also the year that Felicity's head girl and like their final year at Mallory Towers, and I just really enjoy it, and it's one of my big comfort books. Like, I'm a big rereader, and this is one of the comfort books that I'll reread, so I did a reread of that in September. I then read Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt, again one that I hadn't read before, and it's basically about this family who found this elixir which was like a spring of life, and so it meant that they will never die and they will never age, and it's this girl kind of learning about this family and being enlisted and being welcomed into the home, and you kind of get their perspective on life and their philosophy of life from somebody who will never die. I read the teenage writings of Jane Austen. These are the juvenilia that I was talking about before, and I really liked these. They are very bizarre, like they are so absurd, some of them, and I think it's so cool to see just how absurd they are. The writings are also very kind of inspired by Samuel Richardson, and I read, I think maybe it was the introduction to this, or another essay, I can't remember, but talking about how her teenage writings are basically fan fiction of Samuel Richardson, and so it's quite fun to think about it through that lens. But they're very light, very funny, and it's cool to kind of see like the genesis of her work. I also read Austen After 200 New Reading Spaces, and it's basically about like trends in Austen scholarship, which I just read because I've never, bar like one seminar, studied Austen like the whole way through my English degree, and so I just kind of wanted to learn a bit more about the current trends in scholarship, and that felt like the best book to read because it was published in like 2023 or 2024. I read Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Just Can't Stop Talking, and this was a really nice one to read. If you're an introvert, I would highly recommend it because society is built for extroverts, and like there are skills that come with being an introvert, but they're so often overlooked because they don't align with what we would deem good from an extrovert point of view. And so it's a really nice reframe of extroverted culture and how like introversion can be a superpower, and if you are introverted it's actually just a really nice one to read and quite empowering. Oh, I also read, this is another juvenilia of Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, and it just has a selection of extracts from both of their juvenilia. Charlotte Bronte of course wrote about an imaginary world called Gondal with her brother, with her siblings, but specifically her brother, I'll say Heathcliff, not Heathcliff, Bramwell, and her and Bramwell mainly headed up this fictional world of Gondal, and they wrote these stories, and so you kind of hear some of these stories in this. On the same grain, I read Glass Town, The Imaginary World of the Brontes, which is a graphic novel about Gondal, but also the process of setting up Gondal and their imaginary world. It kind of goes in and out of their fictional world and their real life, so it begins with Charlotte reflecting on the death of all of her siblings. She died in childhood, and then Emily and Bramwell died before her, and so it starts with her on the moors, and she's kind of been left the only one of these siblings, and it's her reflecting on the stories and reflecting where they came from, their childhood, and it's so cool as like an exploration of where these stories came from and how integral they were within the family home, and just like for exploring the idea of fiction as a whole, and it's beautifully illustrated as well. I read The Drownings by Hazel Barkworth, which I loved. It's set at a university, and it's thinking about like misogyny within institutional education. There's a group of women who were assaulted, and then there's this big uprising on campus, which is led by both the protagonist and her cousin, who is a social media influencer. It's a book about female rage and witchcraft, and I love that like intersection between 17th century witchcraft and the modern day, because one of the professors who's involved in the movement is an expert in 17th century witchcraft. It's really, really good. If you want a dark academia book, if you're looking for one, this is an excellent one to read. And honestly, I didn't read many dark academia novels this year as I'm looking through, but I really want to read more next year. I read Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. This was a very big book, like a very big book, and it was very eerie, kind of had a Stranger Things feel to it, a lot like The Institute by Stephen King as well, if you like that. So this mother and her son's maybe like 6 or 7, they've just run away from an abusive like husband and father, and they arrive at this new town, and then her son goes missing. So the boy goes missing for 6 days, and then he's found in the woodland, and when he comes out he's not the same, and it's a psychological horror about kind of what happened and the impact it's had on him, and kind of explores like the difference between the real and the not real. Next, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which I finally read, and I was really excited to read because I do love Virginia Woolf, but this is my least favourite of what I have read by her. So I've said in a video that I didn't like this, and people have said, you know, maybe come back to it in a couple years or decades and see if you like it then. So I definitely am going to do that because like, I trust Virginia Woolf and I know that she's excellent. It's just, this didn't really resonate with me. Like, I love the writing, but I just couldn't connect to the characters really. There's one part which is before the war, when the characters are children and they go to this seaside kind of cottage that they go to every year, pre-war summer basically, and one of the children is constantly talking about like wanting to go to the lighthouse, and so that's why it's got that title. Then the second part is set during the war, and it's where the house is empty and everything's falling into decay, and I did love those descriptions. I thought that was really powerful, especially obviously after like the vibrancy of right before, where the house was just a background, and you didn't have to focus on it because you were so focused on the vibrancy and the people inside. But then like when everyone's gone, you're forced to focus on like kind of the details and the little kind of clues that people were there. And then in the final part, they come back and they visit, and I love the structure and I think it's so beautifully done. I think kind of like I really love how it's done. I love it philosophically, and there are moments I found really touching, especially in the second part. I love the writing, but I just didn't personally like connect to the characters enough in the first part to then make the rest of the book as impactful. Like, it's one of those books which, you know, you like theoretically, but then in practice you just kind of like didn't find it resonating. Once Upon a Time in the North is another one of the kind of like short stories by Philip Pullman, which subsidizes the His Dark Materials series, and I've read now all 3 of the short stories that he wrote. Once Upon a Time in the North was my least favorite, because this one's much more adventure based. Like, there's The Collectors, which is more about like the theory of the world, because it's 2 academics talking about kind of the universe, and then Lyra's Oxford is more about like the character, like you're following the character of Lyra, and then His Dark Materials is like more about the world, and so you kind of return to the world. If you really like reading books for plot, then I can imagine you'd really like this, like if you like an adventure book, but I prefer, in His Dark Materials, I prefer the world building and like the kind of theory of the world and the characters to the actual world, and so I think that's why I didn't like this as much, but I was surprised not to like it as much, and I can imagine anyone who likes adventure would really like this. I next read The Fortnight in September by R.C. Sheriff, which I started at the end of September but then read it until mid-October, so kind of like slightly bad timing, but at least I started it in September, and it was so charming. Like, oh my gosh, it was so charming. It was very unlike anything I've read before because it was so slow paced and just so mundane, a bit like The Diary of a Nobody, if you've read that, but even better. So it's basically this family who go on one holiday a year and they go to the same place every single year, but it's the same routine and they go to the same place, and it's this 2-week period which is just separate from the rest of the year. And I just think the book captures like the magic, the like the power, the importance of that family holiday and that kind of break from routine, and the anticipation which is built, and that like it really does have the feel of going on holiday. I also love the like there is a sadness to the book because everyone's growing older, and kind of the place looks different, and it's always going to look different every time you go because you're coming with new experience, and your like kind of the way that you see changes. And it's also a book about aging and time passing, and but it's beautiful, and I love how just kind of focused on tiny moments it is, especially the train journey at the beginning, because I think it was written in the 1920s, first published in 1931, and it just describes this really beautiful train journey, which is so of that era and so like, oh, just excellent. I read Atomic Habits by James Clear, which of course has been spoken about so much on social media. It kind of breaks down the psychology and research into habit formation and how you can build successful habits, and I took so many notes on this book. It was really, really interesting. I read Macbeth by William Shakespeare. I had to do a reread because it's been a while since I've reread this book, and I was in Scotland and I went to Dunamore Castle, which was associated with Macduff, and I had the book on me, so of course I just had to go and read it. Macbeth is in my top 3 favourite Shakespeare plays, and I think it's renowned for a reason. You know, when people say, oh, my favourite Shakespeare play is Macbeth, like, of course, because Macbeth is wonderful. Like, you don't have to have an obscure favourite Shakespeare play. Macbeth is great. My top 3 favourites are Macbeth, King Lear, and The Winter's Tale. Like, has to be. I read The Atlas Six by Olivia Blake, and I was surprised not to have liked this. This was a dark academia novel again. It was like academic fantasy. So just to kind of refresh myself on this, the Alexandrian society, caretakers of lost knowledge from the greatest civilization of antiquity, are the foremost secret society of magical academicians in the world. Those who earn a place among the Alexandrians will secure a life of wealth, power and prestige beyond their wildest dreams. And it's a group of students, like potential academicians, who are like almost like fighting to the death sort of thing. Like they're competing for a place to be one of these Alexandrians. I'm not a big fan of fantasy, and this was just too fantasy heavy for my liking. Like, I like a good bit of magical realism. I like when it's kind of grounded in the real world. I thought that this was just like, it was too much of, it was too high fantasy for me. However, I did love Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is again a dark academia novel, I would say, and it's set in an alternative Victorian London, but I love how Victorian London is otherwise basically the same. Sorry, I say Victorian, it's like early 19th century, not quite Victorian. But slight difference is that there is this magician called Mr. Norrell, and he's trying to reclaim like old English magic, because England was once known for its magicians, and now there are no working magicians who are respected, and like kind of English magic has fallen into ruin. And so Mr. Norrell studies magic, and he kind of performs these really extravagant, like wonderful spells and crafts this incredible magic, which is then used to help the British army in the Napoleonic Wars. But Mr. Norrell's approach is very, very academic. Like, he studies the books very, very carefully. He's very, very particular, and he eventually takes an apprentice, Jonathan Strange, who performs magic in a wildly different way and is much more experimental, and it's like the rivalry between these two men. It's a very big book. Like, it's an investment of time, but it's so worth the investment. Like, this is one of the top books again of the year. Next, I read Steal Like an Artist, 10 Things Nobody Told You About Being Creative by Austin Kleon. In line with the name, it's all about like how artists are constantly stealing, and how all art is like a reimagination of something which came before, and in fitting with like this conception of what artistry is, Kleon basically takes different artists' perspectives on art and like compiles it all together in this book. I read Dewey, the Small Town Library Cat Who Touched the World, and it's basically about this cat who was found and named Dewey and lived in a library, and it's just like the antics that it got up to, and it's like a biography memoir of this cat, and it's so beautiful and very charming, and if you're looking for a cozy read, this is a good one. Then I had a huge reading slump, and I didn't read anything for basically like 3 weeks, and the next book I read was It Was Snowing Butterflies by Charles Darwin, which is selected writings from Origin and Species when he was at the Galapagos Islands. I read Tom Smith's Christmas Crackers, An Illustrated History by Peter Kimpton, which is basically the history of Victorian Christmas crackers. Oh my gosh, I loved this. This was so like different and interesting and charming, and it was illustrated and had all of these wonderful colour illustrations of packets of Christmas crackers, and they used to be so elaborate. Like, Christmas crackers today are so boring in comparison. They were like beautifully done, like kind of works of art really, and if you're interested in like history of Christmas, this is a really good one to try. I also reread A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which is my favourite book of all time. I try to read it every year, but I actually haven't done a reread for the last... I at least didn't do one last year, and so it's really feels like coming home to go back to this book. I then read Sketchy, Doubtful, Incomplete Jottings by Goethe. I'd never read any Goethe before, and I really enjoyed this. It's just little extracts from his journals and tiny thoughts and kind of scraps of philosophy, and it's really great to read. I liked it, and I put quite a lot in my commonplace book actually. And then inspired by that, I read Goethe's Faust part 1, and again loved this. I preferred this actually to the jottings as well. Like, Goethe worked on right throughout his life. He started when he was very young and he just kept on working on it. It's about a scholar called Faust, so we're kind of like harkening back to Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Again, like in Marlowe's, he's very dissatisfied with life, and so God and the devil, who is called Mephistopheles, I'm gonna say the devil, they come up with a pact, and the devil basically says that he can turn Faust into ruin. And kind of like in the story of Job, God agrees to this, and so the devil tempts Faust, promises him all of these things that he wants, kind of appeals to human greed. He ends up falling in love with this very young girl, and the devil helps him have her, and it's horrible, it's awful, because it's this momentary decision and it completely ruins this girl and the whole of her life, and it's like really tragic and very sad and very emotional, and well worth a read. I also read Santaland Diaries by David Sedaris, which I've been wanting to read for a while. David Sedaris is, I think, the best comedic writer out there. He's so funny, and this is about his time when he was working as an elf at Macy's, and like the stories kind of that popped up, and they are very funny. It's if you liked This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay, it's like that kind of vibe. I then read The Quiet Little Woman, A Christmas Story by Louisa May Alcott. It's very charming and same feel as Little Women. It's about a young girl who is kind of very similar, quite similar actually to Anne of Green Gables, but this girl is adopted by this family but to be a servant, and the girl just desperately wants to be loved, and she wants them to show her kindness and wants to be treated like an actual little girl. Like, over the course of the story, the family grows to realise this, and it just has like a very nice beautiful ending where she's welcomed into the family. I also, because I do like to read some Christmas books every Christmas, I read a children's literary Christmas anthology, which is an anthology of passages about Christmas from children's books, and it's just very charming and a beautiful one to dip into over Christmas, and makes you feel very festive and cozy. I reread every year as well. Oh, I didn't add The Nutcracker, but I reread A Christmas Carol and The Nutcracker every year, so I read both of those. And yeah, that's just like tradition. In the 5 days leading up to Christmas, I will read A Christmas Carol and The Nutcracker. And then the final book I read was Insomniac Dreams, Experiments with Time by Vladimir Nabokov. And Nabokov basically kept a dream journal towards the end of his life. This book compiles some of those dream journal diary entries under certain headings, and then it's subsidized with like an essay about the dreams and how they can help us understand how Nabokov thinks about time. And Nabokov has like some really interesting like philosophy on time. Like, he writes about time in a very interesting way, kind of like fear of going to sleep, fear of losing time, fear of losing the present moment. If you're interested in philosophy around time, then Insomniac Dreams could be a good one to read. Though honestly, actually, I think like secondary criticism, like there is an essay I read which was about like Nabokov's conception of time, and I much preferred that to this. Like, I read this because I read that essay and really liked it. This I found quite tedious to read, because dream journals, like, you know when somebody tells you about their dreams and it's quite boring and it doesn't really make sense and you're kind of like trying to follow it, it can feel a little bit like this in this book. So I like it as a piece of editorial work and it's interesting, but if you want to like learn about his conception of time, you'd be better off reading that article, which I will try to remember to leave linked down below. And if I forget, please do tell me. But that's everything. They're all of the books I read, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. The top books I read as well, actually, I will quickly tell you. I've made my list. The top 5 books I read in 2024 were Ophelia Swan, Dr. Faustus, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, the Sidney Salter, you know, the translated Psalms by Mary Sidney and Philip Sidney, and then the autobiography of Lady Grace Mildmay. Can you believe that as I was going through my top 5, I just didn't write down Crime and Punishment, but Crime and Punishment is the top book that I read this year. So let's say Crime and Punishment number 1, and then these 5 are the kind of supporting acts of fantastic books that I read, but Crime and Punishment is definitely number 1, and I just didn't write it down for some reason, so I'm sorry about that. yes, but thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and please do let me know what's the best book you read in 2024. I really do not need any more books for my TBR, but I also always welcome them. Like, it's one of those things which, like, you know, you really shouldn't ask, but then also, what if somebody recommended your absolute favourite book, and if you'd never asked, you'd never read it and you'd never find it? And I always find videos like this very dangerous, and so I'm sorry if you've now walked away with many more books for your already towering TBR, which does not need any more books, but maybe something on here will be like the top book you read. And so you have to watch videos like this, and you have to, like, I'm going to be watching everyone's like reading wrap up, because what if like you end up finding your favorite book? I'm also so tired. I've been filming for like 3 hours, and so I'm going to go get another cup of tea and probably read. I'm currently reading, as I say, the Mitch album One More Day, so I'm gonna read some more of that. But thank you again, and I hope that you have more than just a productive week.